Hello, I'm Lisa Martin from HORIBA Veterinary. I'm delighted to welcome you to our next Continuing Professional Development webinar from HORIBA Veterinary, part of HORIBA Medical. We'll shortly be hearing from James Husband, RCVS specialist in dairy, cattle, health and production. James is very well placed to speak to us today, having a huge breadth of experience in this area, and is still working very much day to day with herds in the field. James graduated in 1993 from Cambridge and spent 11 years in mixed practice before specialising in cattle nutrition. He completed his RCVS diploma in cattle health and production with his thesis on the use of anionic salts to control hypocalcemia. His research interests are around metabolic diseases associated with parturition in dairy cows, and in particular assessing risk factors for all levels of hypocalcemia and for setting preventative strategies. HORIBA are a well-established provider of laboratory diagnostic solutions across small animal, equine and farm work. Our customers and associates include general and referral veterinary practices, reference laboratories and research and educational settings. Our product range includes handheld meters for a single or multiple parameters, fully automated benchtop systems with the capacity for up to 400 measurements per hour, and the first fully integrated in-house PCR testing platform. Here is a brief introduction to our range. Our L'Aqua Twin handheld meters are a crossover from the HORIBA Water Quality division. These meters work in seconds, including pH, metabolites and electrolytes, and can be used on a range of samples quickly and easily in the field. Our unique blood ionised calcium meter, the L'Aqua Twin CA11C, aids in the fast detection of subclinical hypocalcemia in dairy cattle. Using just one drop of heparinized blood, it enables early intervention for better transition, post-calving recovery, milk yield and future fertility. We offer a wet clinical chemistry system with our Pentra PC400, which gives reference laboratory quality results. The PC400 features integrated refrigeration and capacity for up to 55 onboard assays for day-to-day testing and beyond, including standard clinical chemistry parameters, electrolytes, inflammatory markers and acute phase proteins. The HORIBA Pocket Central PCR Analyzer is a benchtop instrument which even the smallest veterinary laboratory can accommodate. All steps of the PCR process are fully automated and can be run by any trained member of the practice team. After inserting your sample cartridge and reagent, the Pocket will present your positive or negative result test outcome just 85 minutes later. No waiting for a lab pickup or for your results to be sent through. The Pocket Central test range includes over 190 different assays for all walks of veterinary life, across small animal, farm, equine, poultry and aquaculture. It can bring fast and easy PCR testing into your practice. We know that subclinical hypocalcemia is a serious problem affecting up to 50% of cows annually. After calving and when lactation starts, total calcium levels in the cow's blood drop, which can lead to suboptimal health and reduce yield. The significantly affected down cow is very easy to spot, but just how many more have problems which are less obvious but are still detrimental to their current and future health? Proactive monitoring of cows enables faster decision making and limits the effects of subclinical hypocalcemia, giving better outcome for cows, farmers and vets. If you have any questions for James or for the HORIBA team during the webinar, please pop them into the Q&A box on your screen and we'll cover as much as possible at the end of the talk. You will also have contact details to reach us after the webinar in case anything springs to mind later. The presentation will be available to watch back later, and you'll be sent details of how to access the recording, which can also be forwarded to anybody who wasn't able to join us today. So now I'd like to hand over to James Husband, who's going to talk to us about bovine hypocalcemia, strategies for prevention and treatment.
Okay, thank you, Lisa, and good evening to everybody. I'm going to talk to you for about the next 45-50 minutes around hypocalcemia. Around hypocalcemia, strategies for prevention, and a little bit about practical monitoring and things that we should be doing for our clients on a sort of fairly routine basis. So when we're talking about, we used to talk about milk fever, and milk fever, of course, is just the clinical tip of the iceberg. And really, we should be talking about subclinical hypocalcemia, because we really should be seeing very good prevention of clinical disease. If we were to estimate the level of clinical disease, so obviously the cows that you see with obvious signs of milk fever, we're not sure exactly what the incidence would be in the UK, but most published data would suggest it's something between 5 and 9%. I would suggest that we should really be getting consistently down to less than 3% in herds. And you'll often find, as you'll see on the picture there on the right-hand side, this is a printout from one of the herds that I visit, where you think you've got actually pretty good control of milk fever. You can see here these are the clinical cases per month on the left-hand side, and most of the time you get, it's a big herd. There's about 700 cows in this herd, so you're getting around about 2 cases, but you have peaks where it does go significantly more than that. So it looks like there's some sort of seasonal variation where most autumns there seems to be some sort of issue, and hopefully by the end of the talk you'll be able to perhaps suggest what that might be that's causing those issues in the autumn. And on a rolling basis here, it rolls around. You see to the right hand side, there's the 12-month rolling averages. It should be rolling around sort of 2%, which is where you'd want it to be. But you get these peaks, and these peaks where it's uncontrolled for relatively short periods means that your rolling average isn't under 3%. It's more like, it can go 4 or 5%. And this is a high yielding herd, and it's a herd where I think when you get very high yielding animals in early lactation with quite a lot of clinical milk fever, you're bound to get quite a lot of subclinical milk fever at the same time. And that potentially will cause you problems, as we'll see. And so I hope that most practices now, if you are called out to ever treat a clinical case, it's not a case of treatment and go, you put the calcium IV, you get the cow up and off you go. If you're seeing consistent clinical cases of hypocalcemia on farm, well, you shouldn't be. You should be going there and saying, you have an issue here, let's have a look a bit more closely at what we can do to prevent it. And there's plenty of things that you can do to prevent it. And you can get more involved through the effective control of clinical milk fever and subclinical hypocalcemia. You can get more involved in the nutritional side of the herd. And it's relatively easy to usually do some quite good troubleshooting and get quite quick positive responses. So why are we interested in prevention? And I think we really are interested in prevention, as we say, rather than treatment. It's very much a gateway disease. So if you do get clinical milk fever and also subclinical milk fever, and we'll look at the definition of that a little bit later, that animal is more likely to get ketosis. So her energy balance is likely to be worsened. That could be due to lower dry matter intake, as cows with clinical milk fever are much more likely to eat less. That could also increase the risk of fatty liver, because if they eat less at a time in obviously very early lactation, which is when we're going to find it, you're more likely to have fat mobilization, and that fat mobilization, if excessive, can cause fatty liver. Fatty liver is very strongly related to immune dysfunction, so that can open the door as well to several other diseases coming in. It's also involved in release of insulin, so calcium is required for insulin release. That is going to have an effect on energy balance. And the other diseases, well, LDAs, there is a link in the meta-analysis work done by Curtis, which is what this is taken from. LDAs are 4 to 8.3 times more likely if you have clinical milk fever. Again, the lower dry matter intake that you're going to get, these cows eating less, you're also going to have reduced abomasal motility. Both of those things are strong predisposing factors for LDAs. Retained fetal membranes, 4 times more likely. Not really sure actually why subclinical and clinical milk fever causes retained fetal membranes, but there has certainly been plenty of papers published showing that there is a link. And that's possibly related to reduced immune function, potentially an effect on antioxidant status, which could come via the increased risk of fatty liver, ketosis. There's a mechanism there somewhere, not quite sure what it is, but there's certainly a link between milk fever and retained cleansings. And mastitis, 8 times more likely in this particular piece of work. Why? Well, it could be reduced teat end tonicity, so the teat ends aren't shutting tightly, so more chance of ingress of muck bacteria. Also, calcium is required for immune function, and possibly if you've got animals in early lactation where they're down, where the teats are slightly open, the immune function is slightly compromised, you're more likely to have clinical cases of mastitis. So it is very much a gateway disease. We do really need to do our best to try and prevent it as well as we possibly can. Let's have a quick look at the physiology. So what we see, if you have a low level of blood calcium, you get an almost instant response from PTH. So parathyroid hormone increases extremely rapidly. And parathyroid hormone has 2 main effects. The main effect is actually activation of vitamin D3 in the kidney. The other effect it has is a direct effect on the bone. So obviously the calcium stores that you have in the cow are going to come from the bone and also from the gut. So we want to have an effect via vitamin D3 activation of calcium uptake from the gut. So when vitamin D3 is activated, the absorption of calcium from the gut increases. At the same time, we're getting through the action of the PTH on the bone, we're getting calcium mobilization. And that should lead to an increase in blood calcium. When blood calcium's gone up, PTH should go back down again, and homeostasis has been maintained. The thing is, this here is extremely rapid. This takes longer. This is round about sort of 36 hours. So that's something to bear in mind, because that has quite important practical effects, that you'll get a very rapid PTH increase, but if you don't get rapid vitamin D activation, then you're not going to get that increase in available calcium coming from the gut and coming from the bone, and you're going to have a period usually in that sort of 8 to 12 hours post calving where blood calcium is going to fall to a very low level, and you're going to get problems. So the demand of calcium at calving, the demand for production of colostrum, that's going to lead to this demand for calcium, and that should then kick into PTH going up, and if we've got things right, more rapid vitamin D3 activation, so we can get the calcium mobilized more quickly, and we don't have that period where blood calcium is teetering around very low dangerous levels in the bloodstream. And we'll look at effects of what we can do to speed up that activation of vitamin D, and also what we can do to get PTH here to bind to its receptor sites more effectively, so we can speed up that vitamin D activation. And it's this tissue refractoriness to PTH which is the cause of clinical milk fever. It's not the failure to secrete the PTH. The PTH will go up, but it's what the PTH does at its receptor sites that is the issue. And it's thought that that's mainly due to disturbances in acid-base status and also a lack of magnesium. So this is some well-known research from Jesse Goff. And what he's looking at here is you've got your PTH. So we know that the parathyroid hormone is going to be secreted. what should happen normally is that will then bind, so your PTH here binds to its receptor sites, and it sets off the chain of events so that you get the vitamin D activation, you get release of calcium then from the bone and increase of calcium uptake from the gut, and that should be reasonably rapid. If you've got adverse conditions, so if you've got a metabolic alkalosis here in category B, you don't get proper binding of the PTH to its receptor sites. The same thing is true when you have hypomagnesemia. So we know pretty well that we should be feeding more magnesium or higher levels of magnesium in a diet just prior to calving than we normally would during lactation. I mean, that's fairly well established. Most farmers have got that message. They need to be feeding things like mag chloride. But perhaps it's less well known that the alkalosis can actually also cause a problem with the binding of the PTH to the receptors. So this idea that alkalosis and hypomagnesemia together, they are going to make the tissues that need to have the binding of PTH to set the mechanism of calcium mobilization in action. Those things are slowed down. They're not as effective in those conditions of hypomagnesemia and metabolic alkalosis. And that all comes down to the acid-base balance, which is caused by it's really the ratio and the amount of the strong cations versus the strong anions that the cow gets in the diet. So the strong cations, so the positively charged, the monovalent ones, so the K plus, the Na plus, they're ones that are very soluble. Monovalent ones are more soluble, they're more active, and they have an effect that if they're not balanced by strong monovalent anions, it will cause a metabolic alkalosis. So diets that are very high in sodium and potassium here relative to chloride and sulfate, those will cause a metabolic alkalosis. And that is actually a normal condition for cows. Cows do not run on metabolic acidosis during lactation. They run as metabolically alkalotic animals. So if you were to go and catch a cow that was standing out in the field eating grass, and you test that cow's urine, the pH will be 8, 8.5. It's quite alkaline, and that's the normal condition for a cow. And it's due to the fact that forages contain an awful lot of potassium, and that tends to cause these metabolically alkalotic conditions. And during lactation, there's plenty of work showing that during lactation, you actually want a strongly positive decab. So an excess of sodium and potassium ions in the diet relative to chloride and sulfate is absolutely fine. It's the default condition for lactating cows. And actually, when you get conditions, something that we'll probably come across in the next couple of months, when it does get hotter, and when cows get hotter, they tend to not ruminate so well, they don't swallow their saliva so well, you will get slightly more acidotic conditions. It's actually quite a good thing to do then during lactation, to give them things like sodium bicarbonate, which contains sodium but doesn't contain any chloride and sulfate. So during periods of heat stress and during periods where you might have a metabolic acidosis caused by ruminal acidosis, it actually does no harm at all to be giving these cows, instead of anionic salts, as we'll give precarb, as I'll show you in a second, to give things that are actually quite alkalotic. So in lactation alkalosis, it's absolutely fine. And you'll see here that there's an optimum level that you can feed diets that are probably plus 200. When they're a bit more challenged with heat, you could go to higher than that, and that's the normal condition that cows will be working at during the lactation period. In fact, here there's been studies showing that in lactating cows, if you give them negative decab rations, so if you give them rations that have an excess of chloride and sulfate rather than sodium and chloride, that will decrease their intake and decrease their milk yield. So lactation, we want decab positive alkalotic diets. pre-calving, we want something different. We want them to be not in a condition of metabolic alkalosis. So in dry cow diets, so these are the diets that we're feeding in the lead up to calving. If we have high decab, so high decab meaning again an excess of the strong cations, the sodium and potassium, over the strong anions, the chloride and sulfur, that will disrupt the calcium homeostatic mechanisms. And really what we're trying to do pre-calving is to bring the dietary cation anion balance down as much as we practically can. Metabolic acidosis also has the effect. So if we do manage to feed a ration that is more metabolically acidotic, we increase the percentage of the total calcium that's in the bloodstream. We increase the percentage of the ionized calcium, and it's the ionized calcium, the Ca2+, that is the active form of calcium. It doesn't alter it enormously, but it will probably change it from, say, 47–48% ionized calcium up to, say, 52% ionized calcium. So it does shift it more towards the active form. It also increases the availability of the labile calcium sources that are available in the bone. So there is more calcium that's available to be taken up from the bone quite rapidly at the time of calving. And if you look at here on the right-hand side, that's a table showing the, I mean, that's the guidelines really for what you're going to be feeding pre-calving on the macromineral content of the diet. So the big thing is we're trying to restrict potassium, because potassium, as we've said, is a very strong cationic cation. So it's something that will have a strong alkalotic effect. So we want to decrease the potassium content as much as possible, and we'll see what that means in practical terms in a little bit. The sodium, we tend to keep it around about 0.12 to 0.25. Salt itself, so if you were to feed sodium chloride, you've got a strong cation, i.e. the sodium, you've got a strong anion, the chloride, and actually the decab of salt is 0. It's neither alkalinizing nor is it acidifying. The reason we don't feed a lot, though, from a decab point of view, it doesn't seem to be particularly detrimental. The reason we don't feed a lot of sodium, though, pre-calving, is there may be an association with udder edema. So we tend to keep the sodium down to 0.12 to 0.2 normally. Phosphorus, one of the things that you may come across in practice is you'll come to some farms where they'll say, I don't have a problem with calcium, with milk fever, but I do have more of a problem with hypophosphatemia. And in my research work, and it wasn't on a huge number of cows, but I didn't see any cows that had a low phosphorus without having a low calcium as well. So I think most of the time you're not going to get much in the way of hypophosphatemia without having some degree of hypocalcemia as well. So I think if you really control the milk fever well, the phosphorus tends to correct as well. And one of the things you mustn't do, and there's quite a lot of meta-analysis work showing this, is that you don't give high levels of phosphorus pre-calving to try and cause less problems with hypophosphatemia at calving and beyond. So don't fall into the trap of thinking you have to feed more phosphorus pre-calving to stop phosphorus problems post-calving. In fact, what you need to do is keep the phosphorus levels quite low pre-calving to improve the calcium and the phosphorus blood status post-calving. Magnesium, round about 0.39 to 0.5. So quite a lot in a milking cow ration. You're probably going to be sitting around 0.25, 0.3. At the moment, when you've got cows going out to grass, you probably want to feed. I often go for the cows with quite a lot of grass going in their diet this time of year. Often feed around about 0.3 to 0.35 to stop any issues with hypomagnesemia during lactation. In the pre-calving diets, you probably would go higher again, so up to 0.5%. There's quite a lot of talk about what you do with calcium. I tend to leave it where it is, so leave it at background levels in the diet pre-calving. If you really acidify the cows pre-calving, so if you feed a very strongly anionic ration and you get the urine pH down from its normal level of around about 8 down to around about 6, 6.5, there's quite a lot of research work showing that perhaps you should increase the calcium content of the diet pre-calving. I don't tend to. I tend to leave it at background levels. Maybe use a little bit of calcium chloride. The reason I use calcium chloride is it is an anionic salt. So if you were to put it in the decab equation, you'll see on the cationic side, you've got no sodium, you've got no potassium, but on the anionic side, you've got 2 chloride ions. So actually it has a negative decab value and it is an acidifying ion. So it's quite useful to create a little bit of metabolic acidosis feeding it pre-calving. It also has a very available source of calcium, but I don't tend to feed very much of that at all. So you would be feeding small amounts. And what I tend not to feed pre-calving is limestone. Calcium carbonate is quite alkalinizing. If you need to give calcium pre-calving because you think that you are acidifying the cows so heavily and you need to be giving something to replace the calcium that's going out in the urine, which I'm not sure you really need to, I don't tend to use limestone because of that effect of alkalinizing, which is not what you want. You don't want something that's going to make your ration more alkalotic. Okay, the thing about then practical rationing is the decab effect is pretty quick on and it's pretty quick off. So if you were to go up to a cow and you gave it a drench of anionic salt, so if you gave it something, and again these are things that have an excess of anions over the strong cations, so something like ammonium chloride, where you've got chloride on the anionic side but you haven't got any strong cations on the cationic side, so something like ammonium chloride or magnesium sulfate or calcium chloride, as we've mentioned, if you were to drench a cow with that, the uptake into the bloodstream would be very rapid. So you'd have a very quick effect and you'd be picking up a acidifying effect. So the urine would change very quickly. Within hours, you'd have a change. So it's a very quick effect on the cow, but you also lose the effect quite quickly. So the take-home message of that really is if you're going to use the decab effect to go up to the point of calving, you need to go to the point of calving with a ration that is not going to be alkalinizing. At the point of calving, you change over, you put them then onto their milking cow ration, but I would feed them on their transition ration all the way to calving, because if you took them off their ration that's going to be controlled, which is going to be more acidifying, and you put them onto a milking cow ration and they didn't calve for 2 or 3 days, you're probably going to lose that decab effect. So leave them on the decab ration with the acidifying effect up to the point of calving, then change them over. And the forage base is in dry cows going to be incredibly important because most of what a dry cow eats is going to be forage. So the biggest part of their dry matter intake is forage. So you have to be able to control that forage base, and especially the potassium content of that forage base to be able to control that alkalinizing or acidifying effect. And I'll show you a few rations now. So these would be, here we've got what I consider quite a good ration to be feeding in that transition period in the last 3 weeks prior to calving. So what we've got here, we've got some grass silage. If you look at the decab value of grass silage, and you'll find this if you look on mineral analysis for grass silage, you won't find it on standard analysis. You have to actually request a mineral analysis of a forage. So if you request a mineral analysis of a forage and you find that a grass silage is about 250, so that's not too bad for a grass silage. Grass silage always tends to be more positive, so more alkalinizing than maize silage and whole crop silage, which tend to be consistently relatively low, so quite good to feed pre-calving. But if you had a ration like that, what you'd be looking at is, so here we've got 6 kilos fresh weight of grass silage, it's 35% dry matter. So that means we've got 2.1 kilos of dry matter coming in from grass silage. We got 4.5 coming in from maize. We got 1.6 coming in from whole crop. We got 1.7 coming in from straw. We got a protein blend in there, and we got some minerals and some mag chloride. So you can very quickly see whether you've got here a strongly acidifying or alkalinizing diet. So what you do is you have the decab value and you multiply it by the dry matter intake of that particular component. So the grass silage component in this ration is contributing 525 milliequivalents in a alkalinizing direction. The maize silage is providing about 810, etc., etc. Magnesium chloride is very acidifying. You can see if you've got a 0.1 here in 0.1 dry matter, so only 100 grams per kilo, it's minus 9,800. So it doesn't take a lot of mag chloride to be able to provide quite a lot of acidifying power. So you add all those things up and you get a total decab of 1,166 in this case. They're eating the 12.8 kilos of that. So per kilo, you're around about 90 milliequivalents per kilogram of dry matter. That's not a particularly high value. So you're probably fairly safe with that to feed to these cows pre-calving. Look at the second ration though. And again, we're looking at the forage because the forage is the thing that they're eating a lot of. So their total ration, the dry matter intake that comes from forage is a lot. And we're feeding here a grass silage and we're feeding 20 kilos of it, and it's 35% dry matter. So that's 7 kilos of dry matter in total from that grass silage. And look at the decab of it. The decab, and this is well within the range of possibility, the decab is 800 in a positive direction. So that's a huge pile of alkalinizing potential that goes in with that grass silage. So really, you have to avoid forages that have very strongly alkalinizing potential like that. So a decab of that sort of level would be horrendous. You really would not get away with that. Despite the fact you put in some mag chloride, again at 100 grams, you still got 437 milliequivalents of in a positive direction compared with just 91. So this ration will definitely cause you problems. This ration probably won't. And if you're choosing your forages, don't go for first cuts. First cut silages almost certainly will have high potassium levels, and that will drive a high decab. What I find from a practical point of view is if you wait until you have sort of second cut, third cut type timings, and especially if things have gone to head, which they often do in June, and you leave the gap between one cut and the second and the cut that you want to take your silage that you want to feed to your cows pre-calving, if you leave a big gap, say 6 weeks plus, you'll find that the potassium content of that forage has gone down. And that, you could then, you wouldn't have put any dung on that. Dung has high levels of potassium. You certainly wouldn't want to put any potash on that. And you'd have potentially then some silage or some hay that you could make from those pastures that would be low decab and relatively safe to feed in that last 3 weeks prior to calving. The other thing that people often do in autumn calving herds is have this standing hay. And that's exactly the same principle, that you've got to the stage where you can let a field go to head. You don't put any dung on it, you don't put any potash on it, and you allow it to go to head, and it will have this low potassium content. And so you can often strip graze autumn calving cows on this standing hay, and it won't be providing those huge levels of alkalinizing potential, those huge amounts of cations. So practically, there's very easy ways. You just don't put first cut grass silages in, and if you can feed more in the way of maize silage and whole crop in that last 3 weeks prior to calving, and straw, especially wheat straw, if you can get it processed well so the cows will actually eat it, that will definitely decrease your risk of milk fever. So if we look at some decab values by ingredient, so the high values, they're alkalinizing. The low values or the negative values are acidifying. So one of the things we haven't got on here because it's so variable is grass silage. Well, we've got it on there, but it hasn't got the degree of variation. So grass silage can go from 100 to 1,000. And it usually is, if you have a milk fever issue, it is usually the grass or the grass silage that is causing the problem. What about molasses? Molasses, a lot of people will feed molasses pre-calving, especially you'll see these in grazing systems. You often have molasses and you have these balls that roll in the molasses that the cows can lick, and it contains magnesium within that molasses, so they're licking on the ball, and as they're licking on the ball because they want the molasses, they're actually taking in some magnesium, which can help to decrease the risk of milk fever. The reason you get away with it is because you're only feeding very, very small amounts of the molasses. So with the forages, we're saying you're eating, they could be eating 75–80% of the total dry matter intake from the forage, so it has a huge effect on the swing of decab. Molasses doesn't. They're probably only going to eat a kilo in fresh weight terms, which is only about 0.6 of a kilo in dry matter terms. So even though it's strongly positive per kilo, there's not many kilos going in. The get out of jail card is often brewer's grains. So if you have a lot of milk fever problems and you're lucky enough to have a farm that's got brewer's grains on them, brewer's grains and straw pre-calving works really, really well because you've got a negative decab value from the brewer's grains. So, you very rarely get any problems if you feed a lot of brewer's grains and things like, as we've already mentioned, whole crop silage, straw, maize in that immediate pre-calving period. Okay, so this is it's probably not obvious. It could be brewer's grains, it could be caustic wheat. If it was brewer's grains, fantastic. If it's caustic wheat, that's not great, because caustic wheat is wheat that's been mixed with caustic soda. So there's a lot of there's sodium hydroxide. So there's a lot of sodium in there, and there's not an anion. So it's very strong in a positive direction. It's alkalinizing. You feed it to the milking cows quite happily, but you don't want to feed much, if any, of that to your dry cows because it's alkalinizing because of all the sodium in there. Okay, so as you said, normally a cow is going to be running 8 and pH down at the y-axis here. They're normally running at around about 8, 8.5 during lactation. When we acidify them, so when we make the ration less positive on a decab front, you don't get much response initially. The decab can go down, but the pH goes down very, very slowly, and you suddenly find that you get a rapid drop off in pH. And actually, if you're trying to get cows to really good levels of milk fever prevention, you probably do need to be down in this sort of level. If you're finding that you're having no problems with the herd and the pH is sitting at 8, I wouldn't worry too much about it because you've probably dropped the decab enough. But in some herds, you do seem to have to go a little bit further, so you have to add a little bit more in the way of acidifying potential, or take a little bit more of a strongly positive forage out to facilitate this, and you get into this sort of area here, and you often get really effective milk fever control. So for me, after playing around with this for years, I find the optimal effect is probably urine pH at about 6.5 to 7. There are warnings with going lower than that. Sometimes you do go lower than that, especially perhaps in Jersey herds where there's a higher risk of milk fever. But if you go too excessive, and you're probably talking going down to 6 or even lower than that, you can drop dry matter intakes. And there have been 1 or 2 reports in the literature about calves that when they are born and the mother's in very strong metabolic acidosis, the calf can be too, and that can actually increase the risk of them not breathing post-calving. So there are potential negative effects of acidifying too strongly. My preferred option for my clients often now is to get a base level in the ration of forages that are not strongly positive, and to make up a blend that's got a bit of protein, some anionic salt mixed in it, and the basic minerals that you need pre-calving. To put that in at 2 kilos, because that's easy. You know, you can tell the farmer, right, 2 kilos per cow. It gives you a known amount of acidification. You then add a little bit more mag chloride just to be able to titrate the mag chloride dose against the urine pH, and then you get to something that is constant, and you don't change anything. You leave it around about that 6.5 mark, and that for me tends to work best. Things will drift when people are changing the background forages all the time, but you don't want them doing that. So is time on the ration important? This is some research work from about 20 years ago I did, and these were the cows that we were acidifying, and these were the control cows. And what we see, and this has been reported since as well, is when you put so we put half the cows, they had the anionic salts in their ration, half didn't. You get quite a rapid acidification. And what you find is you get the lowest pHs after about 4 to 7 days, and then they start to drift up a little bit. So when I'm setting up a herd, I've got a few herds that would be autumn calving herds, sorry, and I'd set them up prior to when they're calving, and we usually put the cows on the ration that we want to calve them on, and after a week I test them, and they're usually as low as they're going to be, and you test them a week later and they've gone up a little bit. So if they're down at pH 6-ish after a week, I don't worry too much, because I know they'll probably drift back up to 6.5. This was trial work where I was acidifying them much more strongly, because I was quite naive to the effects at the time. We didn't see any problems actually in these cows, but it would be lower than I would go now. I wouldn't have cows down at 5, 5.5. I would be trying to get them to about 6 a week after they were introduced to the salts, and they would probably drift then up to a natural 6.5-ish. Okay, so there are other means to control milk fever quite effectively pre-calving, and one of those is a calcium binder. There's a few calcium binders, but the best one is one that uses zeolite A as the calcium binding agent. You can't restrict calcium and get proper negative calcium balance, which is going to make milk fever control effective. Because the background level of calcium that you have in your basic ingredients is too high. You're never going to get them into a negative calcium balance, and you need to do that to be able to have the calcium restriction up regulating the calcium homeostatic mechanisms prior to calving. So you have to use a calcium binding agent. So what zeolite is, it's an aluminium silicate. It's quite a complex looking molecule that's designed to bind calcium specifically. And what you find with it is it does bind the calcium quite specifically. But when the aluminium silicate goes from the rumen into the abomasum, when you have that really, really low, pH 2 in the abomasum, you get cleaving off of the aluminium, and the aluminium is a very strong binder for phosphorus. So on top of the calcium binding, you also get phosphorus binding. And if you look at the blood levels of phosphorus in animals that are on zeolite, they're frighteningly low. You get really low levels of phosphorus, and it's probably part of the mechanism that actually helps with the calcium homeostasis mechanism. So the phosphorus probably helps as well, but you need to be a bit careful, because, and I have seen this, a few cases of periparturient hemoglobinuria where the phosphorus goes so low that the red blood cells actually lyse. So the recommendations with that is, remember we said phosphorus needs to be around about 0.3 to 0.32. I would normally have it pre-calving. When you're using zeolite, I'd have it a bit higher, about 0.35, and that's really to try and decrease the risk of this hemoglobinuria from excessively low phosphorus. As you can see here, I'll talk you through this. So this is minus 17 days pre-calving. Here's calving, and you've got a control group and you've got an experimental group, and the experimental group were given the zeolite A. This was work that was done in Cornell, and what you're seeing here is the percentage of cows that were hypocalcemic, and the definition they used was less than 8.5 milligrams per deciliter. To change from milligrams to deciliter to millimoles per litre, you divide by 4. So these were cows that were less than 2.1 approximately millimoles per litre around calving. And you see the control cows, a large percentage of those cows were subclinically hypocalcemic by that definition. And you look at the experimental cows, and it was an awful lot lower. So these were quite significant. Well, they were significant results here. So the level of hypocalcemia you had in the experimental cows, the cows that were given the zeolite, was significantly lower than the control cows. The great thing about it is it really adds flexibility. So I've laboured the point that we need to use these low potassium forages and low potassium compounds in all the feeds leading up to calving. When you're using calcium binding, you can forget about potassium. You can really feed what you like prior to calving regarding the potassium, because it's the completely different mechanism. You're binding the calcium, you're not worrying about the metabolic alkalosis. So it's a different mechanism. It does give you more flexibility, and you can feed things like, part of the milking cow ration, for instance. There is a limit to how much calcium it will bind. So if you have a milking cow ration that is high calcium, that will exhaust the exolate. So you've got to be a bit careful that there's not too much calcium sitting around in there. So it is good, it works very well, but it's very expensive compared with using the decab route, which would be what I tend to use by default, just taking out the potassium, putting in a bit of ammonium chloride, maybe a little bit more acidification. Right, I mean, what you see a lot of farmers doing is oral bolusing or drenching, and actually this is quite effective at controlling subclinical controlling clinical hypocalcemia, not so effective at subclinical. Most preparations would have about 40 or 50 grams of calcium. There's different salts that are available, and if you look at research work on that, you find that it doesn't actually cause high levels of calcium in the bloodstream for very long. So piece of work there in 2012 showing you only had a 2-hour rise in blood calcium. That may be enough just to keep them on their feet, keep them eating, but it isn't long. You can't give a calcium bolus 2 days before they calve and say that will do them. It really won't. It doesn't last that long. You get a bit more of a sustained release with calcium propionate, but calcium propionate is not as rapidly absorbed as calcium chloride. So it does have its uses. The propionate can be used to make glucose, so it's gluconeogenic, but I tend to use that post-calving cows that are a bit off, rather than cows at calving where you need to get those blood calcium levels up quickly, where I tend to go more for the calcium chloride salts. There was some work looking again at the duration of calcium rise in the bloodstream. Martinez showed using quite a lot of calcium. I think in that piece of work it was 2 Bovicarp boluses, but he saw an 8-hour rise. But really, that's as much as you're going to get. You're not going to get any longer than that. The thing to remember, and this is why I don't tend to use calcium bolusing or drenching as the main way of controlling clinical and subclinical milk fevers in herds, is you will get breakthrough milk fevers if the decab is completely wrong and they're metabolically alkalotic. There's also evidence that you're not going to reverse that decrease in neutrophil function. So this idea that you need calcium for good neutrophil function, so you get decent immunity, the calcium drenches do not seem to reverse that. So they have their place. They're certainly very useful, but they're not the be-all and end-all for controlling milk. You look at the salts that you'll find available. Calcium chloride, very, very soluble. It can get into the bloodstream quickly. When it was first used, and this is not something you need to worry about for the preparations that are commercially available in the UK, but when it was first used in high concentrations, neat in water and pumped straight down with esophageal pumps, it is quite irritant to the esophagus. That isn't something in the preparations you need to worry too much about, though. It's only when you're using calcium chloride powder and drenching it down with pumps. Propionate, we've mentioned, it's not as rapidly absorbed, neither is sulfate. Calcium carbonate, if you see calcium carbonate as the main source of calcium in a calcium drench or bolus, I wouldn't bother using it. It really isn't very soluble, so it doesn't get into the bloodstream very quickly at all. Not very useful. Targeted use, so if you want to use the boluses or the drenches, there have been some pieces of work looking at that, showing that I've highlighted them there in the bold. The cows that you'd get the best responses from, the most cost-effective responses, are the multiparous ones, the ones with low serum calcium enrollment. No surprise there, I suppose. Who, when those were drenched or bolus, they had a reduced risk of one or more health disorders following on from that, and also cows that are fatter with higher milk productions, and also lame cows. So it tends to be the older cows, as you would imagine, the ones that are fatter, the ones that are lamer, and the ones that were more high yielding. They got the most cost-effective responses from those. Okay, so if we just finish off now on monitoring, well, we need to be monitoring clinical cases because, you know, that's obviously what we can see. So we need to have that, and we need to record it, and we need to see when those occur. I mean, hopefully now, going back to the case that I showed you initially in those figures, the reason that we might be having high levels of clinical milk fever in the autumn, it could be that you had a flush of grass and the cows were out of grass, or you had a forage that was always cut, that was on the late autumn flush, which can be quite high in potassium as well. And that was enough to tip them over the edge. So clinical cases, we need to record those, and we need to use those to pick out trends. I do try and get my farmers to do much more subclinical testing, and the machines, the HORIBA, I was fortunate I've got 2 of them, which I've got out on farm at the moment. And they're how I tend to use them is I'll get farmers to blood sample cows, keep the heparinized blood in the fridge, and when you get a few of them together, it's cheaper this way. You get a few of them together and then you run them, and it's easy to do. The thing to be aware of is the HORIBA test, the one I've got, is ionized calcium. So the level you'll get is about half of what you're going to find for normal calcium levels. So normal calcium levels, where you're looking at the total calcium rather than just the ionized portion. These would be the thresholds around about 2.1 or sometimes 2 millimoles per litre. When you're doing ionized calcium, you've got to remember to halve it, because 50% roughly is ionized. And I would get people, these are some of the herds I would have, and you'd get them to just run the samples and see where things start to go wrong. You can see here there's a few cows that are just going outside the bands that we'd want them to sit in. And what are those bands? Oh, I thought this was the next slide, but we'll come to that one in a second. The timing is something that has been given quite a lot of consideration in the literature in the last few years. I find the most practical timing is as soon as possible after calving, because people just get on with it and they do it. They won't have given a calcium bolus or drenched by that stage, or if they have, I wouldn't bother testing those cows, because for 2 to 6 hours, depending on what they've given, you're going to have a blood calcium level that's okay. Do you do it once? Do you do it twice? Do you do it more? At the moment, I'm on the meters that I've got, I'm asking farmers to do it at day 0 and day 2, because I'll show you this next slide. The recommendations are that for cows that are second lactation, you should be testing at day 2, and you look for a threshold of 2 millimoles per litre. I'll come on to that in the next slide. What I found as a working target, though, is if you test your multiparous cows only, so don't bother with your heifers, and you do it as soon as possible after calving. On the herds where I think we've had pretty good control, and apologies that this isn't a scientific study, it's just impressions from herds where I'm taking quite a lot of samples. When things are going well, you get about 75% of your multiparous cows in that first 12-24 hours post-calving with serum calcium levels greater than 1.8. If you expect 2 millimoles per litre in that very early period, I find that you won't find that many, even when you think things are going quite well. It's amazing how much subclinical milk fever you will have. But I think if you get to over 75% of multiparous cows over 1.8, you're not doing too badly. This is some work that came from the States a couple of years ago, and these are the suggested thresholds here. That so for parity 2 cows, the suggestion is to do them at 2 millimoles per litre. The problem I find with all this is that it's just probably a little bit too complicated. You either say do it straight away, or you say do all of them at day 2. I think if you start giving different timings for different age cows, it just gets a little bit complicated on farm. But I think if you were to say 2 millimoles per litre at 2 days, or to do it straight away, and I'm working on seeing whether we are seeing any is day 0 predictive of what you're going to see at day 2. I haven't got the data yet, but I'm hoping that day 0 will give you a pretty good predictor of what you're going to find at day 2, but we will see on that. So finishing off now, yeah, hypocalcemia, well, I would say this, but it certainly is, I think, an important condition. There's, especially in the high yielding cows, you get a negative effect on immune function for sure, production potentially, death. Well, of course, if you miss one and she's down for a long time, there's much increased chance of dying. And also, and this is appreciated by the farmers, hassle. You really don't want to have cows that you can't leave overnight without potentially having the risk of them being dead in the morning. So it's a big thing, and they will thank you for sorting out a milk fever problem successfully, because hassle is a big thing on dairy farms. So if you're trying to predict what's going on and you want to try and prevent, low potassium, low as you can go pre-calving, certainly less than 1.5, ideally less than 1.3%. Avoid first cut grass silage at all costs. Use straw, especially wheat straw, or cereal, whole crop, spruce grains. Keep your mag quite high and your phosphorus relatively low. And you don't want animals with high urine pHs pre-calving if you're doing any urine pH testing. So anything above 8 with a bit of a background niggly effect, you've got too much metabolic alkalosis there. Prevention, I think, as above as a default, yeah, get your ration like that. If that doesn't work, calcium binding does work in those cases very often, and I keep it as a something that we know is expensive. We need to be careful of the phosphorus, but if you really are having problems and you can't crack it by the decab route, I find it very useful to jump in then with the calcium binder. Monitoring, we certainly need to be recording the clinical cases, and blood calcium in the first 24 hours post calving. As I say, this is my working target. 75% of multiparous animals should be more than 1.8 millimoles per litre, and I'll be able to hopefully know a little bit more about this after I've used the meters a bit more, or at day 2 with a 2 millimoles per litre threshold. So thank you very much for your attention. I think there's time for questions if anybody has any.
Hi everyone, thanks so much to James for his really useful, very informative talk. I'm Lisa Martin again from HORIBA Veterinary. You saw my introduction at the beginning there. So a lot to take in there, very technical, lots of data. I'm really glad this has been recorded this evening so we can watch it back and review some of the information that James has given us. Really good overview of his experience and his time spent working with dairy cattle and fine-tuning their management. Our journey's taken us through the prevalence of hypocalcemia, the complications that we might see, and some of those prevalence figures are quite interesting for other issues as well. We did say at the very beginning that we can see the down cow quite easily. but the subclinical hypocalcemia cases that aren't apparent to us are obviously causing problems as well. So being able to pick up on those is incredibly useful. Dietary manipulation, we've talked a lot about that this evening. We have had some questions that have come in about that, so we'll come on to those. And a particularly interesting point about asking for dietary analysis, that you can get greater figures on that if you just ask the supplier. So some really handy hints there. And James obviously is working with some very big herds. We heard at the very beginning that he was dealing with up to 700 cows at a time, but I think the principles of this apply to even the smallest small holding too. So I hope that everybody's been able to take away some really useful tips from this evening's talk. So a couple of questions that have come in already. If there is anything else that you would like to know that we haven't covered, then please pop it into the Q&A box that's on your screen. We'll come on to those. A quick reminder that this evening's presentation has been linked to the HORIBA LACWA Twin Calcium Meter, which James touched on. Obviously, he's been using one of those. That was part of the talk this evening, that we wanted his feedback on how he's got on with it. And it is a meter that's very easy to use cow side, so hopefully you can make judgments on cattle very, very quickly. Just to add as well that there is a special offer on that at the moment. If anybody's joining us from outside the UK this evening, I know we've got some people in that are outside. The offer is UK only. If you would like to know more about the meter, which is available for calcium, as well as the pH meter we have too, then we can send you details on. Please pop your details again into the Q&A box, and we'll send information on after this evening. So we have our questions coming along. We touched on, James, what is the view on calcium binders? That came in at about 8 o'clock, so I think we may have covered that. That was Robin has asked that question. Thank you very much for submitting it. Robin, if there is anything else that you wanted to know that James hasn't covered, please pop another question in the Q&A, and we will go back to that for you. And then we've had a query, another one from Robin, asking, what is the approach when cows are kept on pasture with potassium levels of 3 to 4%? Could you comment on that for us, please, James?
Yeah, sure. It's very difficult. I think, you know, if you are in the sometimes the autumn calving herds, you get issues when they're first calving in maybe August, September, before perhaps they're brought in. And, you know, if you are getting real problems because the pasture is, you know, 3-4% potassium, the only things you can really do are to take them off that pasture and put them on to something else. I mean, if it's really bad, I would encourage some farmers to take the high-risk cows off that pasture and maybe keep them in for the last week or so. Ideally, you don't really want a ration change a week before calving, but you know, if you had cows that you brought in to restrict that amount of grass that they were taking, and you could give them something else that could substitute for that, you know, sometimes it just is something you have to do, unless people are just, you know, they can jump in potentially if you can do it, and it's a bit of a hassle chasing cows around to bolus them or drench them out in the fields unless they're happy doing that sort of thing. But that is, it's quite a hassle to do that. So I think the standing hay is a good idea. So if you have the standing hay, you put it behind a you feed them with it with an electric fence, and you allow them to run back into the buildings if you can do this, and give them a ration, you know, even just a small part, a little bit of a blend with a little bit of mag chloride in there, that can work quite well as well. But you know, grass is a real problem. The only way you can do it is to take them off it if you're having real problems, or try and dilute it down some way.
Okay, Robin, I hope that's answered your question. If there's anything further on that, please pop it in and we'll come on to that one as well. A question from Heather. Do you have any recommendations for smaller milking herds that run dry cows within the milking herd? That's relating to possibly bolusing cows.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes with the smaller herds, if the forages that they're on are not particularly high potassium, you can sometimes run those quite happily, and you won't you won't get any problems. But as soon as you start hitting, you know, if the ration that the milking herd is on is high potassium, the risk will go up. So again, you either separate them off if you can, but it is a hassle for the smaller herds, or when it gets close to calving, you bolus them. And as I said, the thing about bolusing is it doesn't last for very long, so you've got to be quite accurate with your timing. And if they don't calve when you think they're going to calve, you know, you bolus them again. But sometimes that is just a practical way of doing it. You get Bovine Calc or one of the other boluses, and you know, you put those down. It's often, you know, to do anything more than that just creates a lot of complexity and work that people, you know, are normally in the smaller herds not particularly keen to do.
Okay, I guess with the smaller herds, it's perhaps less of a you know, an onerous task, but still one that's got to be done. And you did touch on the different options for calcium supplementation as well, so that was very useful. We have had also a question that's come in just around the use of mineral licks and blocks. Do you have any particular thoughts on those?
Yeah, I mean, they do help a little bit. When you look at the amount that you can deliver on a mineral lick, it's relatively low on, you know, on the trace elements, because you only require very small amounts of, you know, things like copper and zinc and all the other trace elements. You know, they can supplement on those in an okay fashion. The trouble with most of the stuff where you're trying to alter the acid-base balance is you're dealing with macro minerals, and the macro minerals, macro meaning you're feeding a lot more of them, and it's quite difficult to be able to deliver enough to be able to have a significant acidifying effect. So they probably don't help enormously on milk fever. They'll help a little bit, but not enormously. And sometimes I think I touched on them, the molasses, you get these ball licks with molasses mixed with mag chloride, and a ball that the cows lick on the top that rotates and picks up mag chloride. Those are probably as effective as the licks actually for milk fever prevention. It's just a question of the quantity of macrominerals you can get in with the licks.
Okay, that's really helpful. Thanks, James. I think that's all of the questions we've had so far. If there's anything else that anybody would like to add, please shout up now. Nothing else further to add at the moment. We'll just give it another minute to see if anything else comes up.
The other thing to say in the smaller herds is the big herds are easy because you have dedicated rations for everything. So, you know, it's worth mixing up a ration for a large number of cows. The trouble with the smaller herds and the intermediate size herds is, you know, the time that you need to control the macrominerals really carefully to get the milk fever prevention is that 21 days prior to calving. You don't really need to bother with the far off dry cows, the ones that are, you know, from 21 to just been dried off, so to 60 days or whatever. But, you know, you'll often find that rather than run a dedicated ration for a very small number of cows, they'll either say, well, let's do all the dry cows with the ration, which you can do. You need to be a bit careful that you don't overfeed the cows for long periods. You know, you can either do that where you're mixing up a TMR for all of the cows that are dry, or sometimes, and it's not ideal, but I know people that do it and get away with it, mixing every other day. And you need to be careful with your components then that nothing's going to heat, and maybe you have to put something in to keep it stable, but sometimes that gets around the problem of very small group sizes. The other thing to mention on the smaller herds is I'm quite a fan of, you know, if you can get hay or round bales that are made from the right fields, so ones that have been cut quite late, they've had no potassium on them, they've had no muck on them, you can get quite low potassiums in those, and you can feed them as round bales, more or less free access in the smaller herds that are not particularly technical. And then when they get close to calving, you can feed things like dry cow rolls, and dry cow rolls will usually be, there's different levels of complexity, but they'll basically be palatable enough to be able to allow magnesium to be put in there, because the magnesium is what is needed. And sometimes you'll have some anionic salt in there as well, but you have to be a bit careful putting too much anionic salt in, or they won't eat the rolls, because salts don't taste particularly nice.
No,
So
we know that's an issue about palatability. So careful management. It's not just the cats and dogs that we worry about palatability with, it's the cows as well.
Absolutely.
A little bit more that's coming in on the questioning. So James, any incidents of low vitamin D causing issues with MF in herds, milk fever, can levels be assessed in feed analysis?
It's very hard to do it in feed analysis. The fat soluble vitamins in general, so that's A, D and E, you tend to assume that there's nothing going in the background forages. With the trace elements, you'll measure how much of the trace elements are in the background feeds. With the fat soluble vitamins, the NRC recommendations are that you say there's really nothing in the background feeds, which of course there will be, but you don't know what it is. And so all the recommendations for fat soluble vitamins are supplementation over whatever is in the background level. So it's usually with vitamin D, you say you want 22,000 international units per cow in the lead up to calving. But no, assaying it is really difficult. I've had a few herds where we've tried to blood sample to see if the vitamin D levels are low, and that's really been related to brittle bones and cows that we're thinking there's too many broken bones on the farm, and it's quite expensive, and the reference ranges are not particularly well known. So you end up just saying, let's just stick it in. It doesn't do, you give it to the levels in NRC recommendations, you're not going to do any harm doing that, and you just have to usually make that assumption. You have to just put it in.
Okay, that's really helpful, James, and hearing about what other issues that causes. I think if somebody's at the point of getting lots of broken bones, there's probably something a bit more going on there, isn't there? But
yeah, I mean that's something that's been recorded more in the very high yielding herds where you've got low levels of vitamin D and probably no exposure to sunlight at all. It's been reported as a potential risk factor. Okay,
that's really helpful. Thank you. No other questions so far. So last call for any other queries. If there's anything else you'd like to know whilst we've got James online this evening, it's certainly been really, really helpful. And the amount of knowledge that James has just in his head is absolutely phenomenal. So I think that the farms and vets that are working with him are very lucky to have access to that resource. So thank you so much to everybody who's attended, who's taken the time out this evening to join us, whether you've been working in practice, working in industry, or doing something else. And also huge thanks to James for sharing his expertise with us. We've really appreciated him taking the time out to join us to write the presentation and to answer your questions this evening. If there is anything that springs to mind after tonight, you've got our contact details on the screen in front of you. You can reach myself or Paul Limer, who's our veterinary business manager, through the HORIBA details there. Access to the webinar will be available shortly in the next day or so via the HORIBA website. If you search for HORIBA UK and look for veterinary, you can find the webinar under the support section there, and our previous webinars, which have been more small animal bias than this one this evening, you will find those there as well. We have a further webinar booked coming up in July, which is around raw feeding in pets and bacteriology. So if you'd like to join for that one, keep an eye out for it. And we're also participating in events later in the year as well. So we're up to aquaculture in Aviemore very shortly. We're at the BVA Congress, we're at Vets Cymru, BVA Live and the London Vet Show. So if you'd like to know anything else about HORIBA products, then please come and see us or pop a question across to us. And if there's anything else that you would like to learn from James after today, you can either contact him through the HORIBA team or through the Map of Ag business, which is where he's based. So I think that's everything for this evening. There will be a questionnaire following, of course. We would really appreciate your feedback. If there's anything else that you would like to hear about from HORIBA Veterinary, then please do let us know. Obviously, we want to produce content that's engaging, that's interesting for our customers and potential customers. So if there are things that are important to you, then please tell us about it. And I think that just remains to say another thank you to James and to the rest of the HORIBA team who've helped in putting together this evening's webinar. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening. Thanks very much. Good night.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.